I am Kelly Brown Douglas, and you are listening to Just Conversations, where we explore the racialized inequities intrinsic to our nation and our collective responsibility to create a more just future. Later in this episode, I will speak with a leader who we connected with through the Poor People's Campaign, who is working for fair wages and fair working conditions for the people of Baltimore. But first, I am speaking with the Reverend R.J. Powell from the East Tennessee Diocese, who serves as chaplain at the Tyson House at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and who serves as Tennessee clergy deputy here at the convention. I am speaking also in this conversation with the Reverend Charles Graves IV, who is campus missioner for the Houston Canterbury House and a member of the executive council of our church. Both of my guests are members of the church's LGBTQ plus caucus. Today, we discuss the resolutions on the floor of the convention that bring LGBT and women's justice to the forefront of the church, as well as discuss their thoughts on what it means for the convention to be in Baltimore City. I want to jump right in asking you about some of the resolutions that are before us on the floor and were calendared to come, two of which were calendared, I believe, to come up for vote on yesterday. Given the times in which we now find ourselves, particularly in the aftermath of the Dobbs versus Johnson decision, in which Roe v. Wade was overturned, and the implications of that decision by the Supreme Court that go beyond simply abortion rights, but they're about reproductive rights and implications not only for women and women's body justice, but implications for the LGBTQ community, particularly trans persons, and the implications beyond the Dobbs decision for what is to come in the courts, given the way in which this decision was made. And we've already been given a warning of what will follow. And so this is the time when our church can lead the way on the public square and give voice in a wider moral imaginary of what justice looks like. So I just think this is such an important time for resolutions such as the ones that have been before us. The resolution asking for a staff position in the national church as it relates to LGBTQ persons, plus persons, and women, as well as the establishment of an LGBTQ plus task force. I'll start with you, Father Powell. Can you speak to the importance of those resolutions and the status of those resolutions?
It's an incredible time for the church to be speaking, and the church has been speaking, and we have come a long road, and especially the last decade, in establishing rights for our LGBT uh, siblings in the church, and how that speaks to the greater society around us. And it's such resolutions that are before us that we continue to have a public voice and say we are working on this within ourselves, because if we don't work on it within ourselves, we have no right to say anything about anybody else. And so I think it saying we are establishing a full-time position on the national church and the presiding bishop's office to work, especially regarding women in our church, and LGBTQ community in our church, to have a focused person who is going to help our church to articulate what are those issues for us that we are facing today, that we continue to face. And we think that women in ministry, we're at 40 years and with
That's right.
ordained women this year, and in our church, but there's so much more to go. And with the recent Supreme Court decision, it shows that we are able to go backwards those rights and the ground that we have gained, we can lose that ground if we're not careful and we're not actively pursuing justice in our church and in our world. So that's the importance of our work in very real and tangible ways here at the convention.
Yeah, and Father Graves, what strikes me in listening to Father Powell and in light of these resolutions is the intentionality of naming these communities, right? Because one of the things that we've recognized through the Dobbs decision, that gender and race even are not mentioned in the Constitution, which allows one then to suggest that those are rights not guaranteed by the Constitution. And indeed, that's what's happened. So could you speak to the importance of the intentionality? And I must also say that I was surprised and ought not have been that, wow, we don't have those positions in the church. We don't have that task force established in the church. So I'm surprised that it's taken us so long to get there.
I agree with you absolutely. So I live in the state of Texas. Father Powell lives in the state of Tennessee, two states that have both already, as we are speaking, functionally banned abortion access, and two states where, to be very frank, my marriage and Father Powell's both rest on a 5-4 Supreme Court decision by a Supreme Court that no longer exists. I said to someone recently, just as a new Pharaoh came to power who knew not Joseph, right? A new Supreme Court has come to power who knew not Oberfell, right? Oberfell v. Hodges. That's the world in which we live in, essentially. And so our church's activism, our witness in states like ours and in all across this country and in the other country, the many countries represented by the Episcopal Church that also don't have equal marriage access and abortion access, and are so critical. And so we need someone, a consistent voice on the staff of the Episcopal Church to help all of us to speak up and speak out. And as you mentioned, gender and sexuality are so deeply tied together.
That's right.
We had an officer for women's ministry some triennia ago, and that position was eliminated. And since that position has been eliminated, we see now, both in the public square and within our own church, how important it is to be able to have that consistent voice. And so we're pushing very hard for this. We're glad that it has. I am so thankful for our friend and LGBTQ Caucus co-leader, the Reverend Dr. Cameron Partridge, who wrote Resolution DO93, and that resolution is kind of reincarnated in the form of AO63, if my numbers and letters are correct. And so it's very important that we get this through now, even more than ever, in the time in which we live.
Yeah, so let me ask you, thank you for that. You're, again, so right in this. I am going to, as my younger sister often says, I am just going to claim the victory and recognize that our church that is committed to the Jesus movement and the beloved community, that it's going to be a fait accompli, that our church will pass these resolutions. So let's see if it's going to live into being church. So when it does, I'm going to claim that victory because I don't see how it could do any other given who we claim to be. How should the church, you think, show up then in places like Texas, in places like Tennessee, and in places like Florida, and simply on the public square in general to show expand our understanding of justice and to assure these rights for, well, all of God's children?
Well,
I'll
chime in there. I think that Christianity and Christians have been given a kind of a bad rap by a large demographic of our sisters and brothers in Christ. I'm not going to point fingers and name names, but we have a unique witness and version of the Jesus story that I think speaks to our time. Right. Bishop Curry in his address this morning named several statistics of how bad of a reputation we have as a church in the public's eye. But on the other hand, he mentioned that 80% all across the board of people who say Jesus is someone that deserves to be listened to, and who they want to hear more of. So Jesus is our message. Jesus needs to remain at our focus. And I think as Episcopalians in 2022, we have a version of the story that is not like versions of hatred and discrimination that we have so often heard being proclaimed in the name of our Lord. But we have a unique witness, and especially in places like Texas, Tennessee, here in Maryland, all across the United States, all across the 13 nations that the Episcopal Church exists in, and more, plus Europe. I think they count Europe as one. That we have a version of Jesus, a version of love, a person of love, and that we incarnate and that we live not just with resolutions, but out in the real world, and how the resolutions actually meet the actual lives of people that we are in relationship with. And so I think that it's so important to remember and to share. It is about Jesus. It is about that good news, and that's, I think, what's unique. The unique thing that we bring to the table as Episcopalians.
I appreciate hearing you say, Father Powell, that it's beyond resolutions, because we can, we also have a reputation for coming to these conventions, and we love to make resolutions. And there are over 400 resolutions before this convention, and then no one knows what becomes of the resolution, and we don't show up in the world as even those resolutions may suggest. So I like this notion that the resolutions really are resolved to act, not simply within the church, but beyond into the world as church. So, which leads me, excuse me, to ask you this, and Father Graves, I'll ask you this in relation to that. There's a resolution on the floor regarding Lambeth Conference. And we know, of course, that comes up in a couple of weeks after this convention, where the Anglican Communion of Bishops gather. And it's always a controversial conference, but this even more so, because they have restricted those who can participate. That is, the spouses of same-gendered marriages cannot come to Lambeth, while others can. There's a resolution stating our dismay. Okay, we're dismayed, but should we be going? What can speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I first want to thank my very good friend, the Reverend Philip Sheeran of Western Massachusetts, for writing that resolution and bringing it to us through the LGBTQ Caucus, and getting it out there. And I want to say, on one hand, we kind of have to do two things at once. On one hand, we have to recognize the progress that we've made. Of course, Gene Robinson was not even allowed to attend Lambeth in 2008. So now we're at least at a point where I believe we have now 5 openly LGBTQ bishops in the Episcopal Church, and 3 or 4 others in other parts of the Anglican Communion, and now 1 more bishop-elect are able to attend, and we're thankful for that. But we recognize that at the same time, that's not enough. If the spouses of all of the heterosexual bishops are able to attend Lambeth, then the spouses of our same-sex married bishops should be allowed to attend also. That is the basic fairness that we incarnate as this in this church, in this global Anglican Communion, and we have to be fair in that sense. And so we need to continue to speak up, to raise that voice as the Episcopal Church, and continue to be the leading voice for LGBTQ equality across this communion. In October, I authored a resolution in Executive Council speaking up on behalf of the council and as a major voice in this church against homophobia and homophobic laws in Ghana that had been endorsed by the bishops of
That's
Ghana.
exactly right.
So we've got to continue to be to speak up, to be an active voice, because we've got to speak up for the many people across this communion whose voices are denied. Many LGBTQ folks whose voices are denied, who have no voice because of the active homophobia in their provinces of the communion.
Thanks for that. I tell you, Father Grace, I must say that I continue in some ways to be astounded by the way in which the communion Lambeth discriminates against same-sex marriages, and yet says little about those who keep silent or perhaps are complicit in the oppression and actually death and the very life-threatening laws in their very diocese against LGBTQ plus persons. And so I appreciate hearing how you say we must continue to give witness to that and lifting up. But I see in so many ways the hypocrisy of our communion in letting certain things go and not naming them as sinful, yet at least implying something about the sacredness of certain loving relationships. Huh.
There's something though, I think that that as the LGBT community brings to the table is our experience with that in our own lived experience.
Mhm.
I remember talking with my bishop about whether he was going to Lambeth or not, and bringing my concerns, like, well, are you going to show up? What will that say? And so we actually came into a kind of a heart-to-heart and some agreement that, showing up is so important. Even if you disagree, showing up and meeting people face to face, it changes so many things. In a world where social media is king
Yeah.
and vitriol and hatred are so easy to spew at someone across a screen, having face to face and meeting heart to heart, it really changes the game. And so I think my prayer is that at Lambeth, those folks who get to meet these our LGBT bishops get to see that they're human beings. They get to see the human face, the human heart, and the love of Jesus and the image of God that is in them as well. And I think that that's the witness. That's our experience as LGBT people. So often we come out of the closet, and it changes my experience. It changes so many people's. I know someone who is. It's not just an issue without a face anymore. It's a real human being, flesh and blood in front of us, and I think that really changes. It changes hearts. So I'm grateful that some will be able to do that, and hope that God will open hearts.
Thank you for that. And I agree. I think that's so important and very important that the church lives into being church by showing up with
Yep.
our LGBTQ siblings and showing up boldly and forcefully in that regard. I promise to get you out of here, so I'll get you out of here on this question. Just gonna shift some gears. I'm gonna use your showing up, Father Powell. We're a convention now that is in the city of Baltimore, not unlike many other urban centers in our nation, a city riddled with what I call the crucifying realities of poverty that disproportionately fall upon people who look like me, people in the African American community. Just yesterday, which would be Thursday, in Baltimore, not too far from where this convention is being held, as many of you probably know, as you two probably know, there was a homicide in that one
right outside this window. Actually.
Right out. That's right. My son lives right down the street from there by an incident with a squeegee boy. As my son and I were saying, no, we didn't want anyone to get killed and don't condone that homicide. But that incident is symptomatic of what's going on in Baltimore. No one grows up and says, I can't wait to become a squeegee boy. It's symptomatic of the poverty that is Baltimore and the deaf fostering conditions in which people live. How should, right down, as you say, right out the window from where you are sitting, how must the church show up and make itself known as church in Baltimore right now? Charles, all Father Graves.
That's fine. No, I would love to talk about that. So first of all, I'm a son of Baltimore. I grew up son of St. James, actually
Yes.
born in DC, but raised right here in this city. It's good to be home. Father RJ and I, so we've built an organization together, but we met for the first time in person yesterday, just outside of the Sheraton. And just as Father RJ and I locked eyes, we both looked just, a few meters away, a few yards away, at where traffic had been blocked off because of that shooting, just literally minutes before. And so that's of course very fresh in my mind and in all of our minds. I'll be again real honest. I'm a 32-year-old Black man from Baltimore City. So many of these things, when these things happen as frequently as they do, I think woe, yea, but for the grace of God in so many ways. Could it have just as well been me as that squeegee boy, a block away? And we have to be very honest about that. We have to be very honest that these are real human beings, children of God, our siblings, and not only because they could be any of our sons and daughters, but because of the systemic injustices that we've talked about. We don't witness that because so often it's so easy for so many of us to think, oh, that's something that happens in Baltimore, in Detroit, in Chicago. I don't live in one of those places, so and we think it doesn't apply to us. But if we believe in Jesus, if we believe, as you mentioned, a crucified Savior who bore the brunt of violence and death, then we know that it's our bodies as much as it is those who to whom it occurs day after day. And so if we talk about it from that way, from the base of our faith, from the base of our soul, then we'll understand that we have to offer our spaces as as space for community and for safety. That we have to offer everything that we have, our treasure, our abilities, whatever it is, and our voices to speak up in so many different ways. We're a church with so many gifts to be able to give, and we have to truly live into that and know that we do it because of Jesus Christ. And I think if we do that and we consistently speak up, we will create so many more opportunities, and we'll create a better world and a better church in our cities and everywhere else as well.
Father Charles Graves and Father RJ Powell, this brief but very rich conversation, I think, has been inspiring and challenging. Speak up, show up, and remember that we are a part of a people who follow Jesus. And so show up in that way in the world. Thank you both for your time, for your witness, for your ministry, and for the voice that I know will be yours at that general convention to help our church become, well, church. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So much. God bless you. It's a pleasure, honor.
For today's second interview, I spoke with Todd Cherkis from United Workers, an organization fighting for fair development, universality, equity, participation, transparency, and accountability in Baltimore. He has worked on many high-profile unionization battles in Baltimore City. He and I talked about his work and how he is reframing the debate around development projects to center the conversation on workers' rights, wages, and fair conditions. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. I want to jump right in here. You do work with, amongst other things, the United Workers, and they have a very strong presence in Baltimore. Can you tell us something about the United Workers?
So the United Workers was founded in 2002 at a homeless shelter that was an abandoned firehouse that was converted into a shelter. And what we started with was looking at why are people living in the shelter and are homeless? Like, what is at the roots of that? And what we learned at that time, back in 2002, that many of the people that were staying in the shelter were working, but they were working at jobs that just weren't paying enough to make ends meet. And many of them were working as temporary workers or day laborers, where they were hired and fired each day. They didn't know their schedule from one week to the next, and were often paid well below the minimum wage. And the largest employer was the Camden Yards baseball stadium. So
Yes.
as folks are gathering down at the Inner Harbor, in that same general kind of sports and entertainment area is the Camden Yards baseball stadium, as well as the Ravens Stadium. And for a long time, those stadiums were cleaned every night with workers that were making $3 an hour under the table and not being able to, and many of which were homeless. And so we organized those workers and fought for a living wage for many years, from 2004 to 2007. Those years we organized at the stadium and won a living wage after workers threatened to go on a hunger strike in front of the stadium. And then the mayor and the governor and the powers that be agreed to our demand for a living wage. And then the next year we were able to unionize that stadium workforce. But what we saw in that campaign was this kind of unaccountable public subsidies that were going into these types of developments. So the stadium was owned by the state of Maryland, still is. It's not owned by the Orioles. The Orioles pay a nominal rent fee, and then the state maintains it and cleans it and all those things. And what we learned was that is kind of a standard operating procedure, is that a lot of public money goes into major corporations and corporate developments that seem to not have any standards for how communities would be impacted or actually benefit from those things. So at the time when Camden Yards was built, it's now lauded as one of the historic and famous stadiums in the country, but at the time people didn't really want it. And politicians were able to get it over the hump by promising, particularly in Black communities, jobs.
That's right.
These are largely underserved communities to begin with historically, as well as redline neighborhoods. So they've been disinvested in many ways. And so on the backs of that promise, a stadium gets built, or two stadiums get built with the Ravens Stadium. And yet those jobs that were promised turn out to be jobs you can't live on, much less pay rent and raise a family on for too much. So we saw that, so we saw the stadium, and then we moved our work to the Inner Harbor for a long period of time as well. And what we learned from that was very similar to the stadium in terms of lots of public money going into a project meant to solve a problem. At the time, the Inner Harbor was heralded as a panacea to the loss of industrial jobs. So as the Sparrows Point steel plant and other manufacturing left Baltimore, at one point that plant employed over 30,000 workers. It's gone now. It doesn't exist. And so to replace that was this belief that we could raise up a tourism zone called the Inner Harbor, and that would create enough jobs to benefit and keep the city thriving. And what we saw when we went down to the Inner Harbor and talked to workers was actually people were paid oftentimes less than minimum wage, made to work off the clock, endured sexual harassment, endured unhealthy working conditions, and it was seasonal work. So the minute the summer ended, their hours got cut to the point where they were often, asked to leave and go on unemployment or find something else to do. And so many people at the harbor had more than one job because they couldn't really live on the job that they had at the Inner Harbor. So we saw there, and this is a development project that as people come back to Baltimore for the conference, most people in the city view the Inner Harbor as kind of a dead zone at this point. Yeah. Much businesses have left. The original owners of the Inner Harbor's two different historic pavilions are long gone. They've been replaced by other owners who then were replaced by Wall Street investors. So it's changed hands many times, and it's just not viewed very favorably in the city anymore. That said, workers still work down there for they're not unionized jobs. They don't have they have any kind of protections. And like I said, at the end of the season, once school begins again in September, those jobs almost all but disappear. So they're not really going to sustain a city. And again, that the way the Inner Harbor was built and was continued to be invested in was largely through public investment and including money that was from the Housing and Urban Development Department of the federal government. That money was meant for poor and working class and Black neighborhoods in Baltimore, and was really diverted to this other project. I'm going to skip several decades to the rebellion that took place in the wake of Freddie Gray being murdered by the police in Baltimore. And the city's solution on hand, there was two different solutions. Most of the city dialogue was on trying to eliminate the neighborhood that Freddie Gray came up in, called Sandtown Winchester, and blaming the problem of police abuse, in essence, on the neighborhood and on the people themselves. This distorted moral narrative where we end up blaming the people most impacted for these systemic problems. So there's a lot of push to demolish the neighborhood. And in fact, one section of public housing was in fact cleared by the city. And then the other thing that they did was the city just supported a massive public subsidy, probably I think it was the highest level of subsidy ever in the city's history, to the Under Armour Corporation to build a campus and sports complex of some kind in South Baltimore. So that's where they chose to demolish a part of a Black and poor neighborhood and rebuild somewhere else. And we're, workers in the middle of this, struggling with how do we put forward a different vision for development. And so we came up with a campaign to demand the creation of an affordable housing trust fund that would earmark millions of annually $20 million a year to develop housing for the very poor. So when we say affordable housing, we don't mean, oftentimes cities say affordable housing, they mean housing for people making $80,000 and up.
Exactly. Right.
This is for people very much below the median income, well below. So between 30 and 50% of the median income. And so that was the campaign that we did, and voters overwhelmingly approved that measure to create the trust fund by over 80% back in 2016. And then we went on from there to create a campaign and win a campaign to fund the trust fund.
Yeah, I thank you so much for that history. I remember very much. I'm from Maryland, in that area, and taught for years in Baltimore, and during, of course, the time of Freddie Gray's murder. And so I remember very much, first the promise, quote unquote, of development and how that was going to help the city of Baltimore, and the excitement from the powers to be surrounding that National Harbor and the two stadiums. And remember the immoral narrative surrounding what happened in Freddie Gray's neighborhood. And so what we see, and first of all, we know when conventions come in, like the church, they're going to be around that that Inner Harbor area, right? And not understand in so many respects how that is an area and that of development that has exploited the city, the poor, and the people. And we're talking about working poor. So two questions I want to ask you. I know you ran a campaign to declare that area a human rights zone. And I would like to hear more about that. And, also the contrast between something like the Inner Harbor, which now, as you're right, isn't as attractive anymore, but something like the Inner Harbor, an investment in these kind of things. And I remember the controversy around that Under Armour campus, the contrast of investing in these things while at the same time divesting in the communities where the Black people of Baltimore live. I have never seen such neighborhoods, and other cities that are so where you can have a row of 5 or 10 houses and then one that is occupied. And there just seems to be utter divestment in the communities of the poor in Baltimore, which, as we know, are disproportionately Black. So I've asked 2 questions in one: the human rights zone, and how can we perhaps declare these communities human rights zones that people have right to housing?
No, I love that. It's good. It's a good contrast. And so at the Inner Harbor, we organized low-wage workers there for a number of years. And our biggest, well, we kind of had 2 successes. One that would be kind of viewed as a success in a standard way, which was ESPN Zone, owned by Disney, got rid of all, like, closed, and they didn't tell their workers really. So workers got notice, found out they were losing their jobs on Facebook and other social media platforms when the news broke. And these are workers that had been mostly at the ESPN Zone for years. We're it's fair to say we're pretty heartbroken at the news. Some of which became homeless. Some had to move to other cities to survive. We took on the task of organizing those workers who became unemployed, and with the help of legal aid and then the help of a law firm, sued Disney for violating a federal statute called the WARN Act, WARN Act, because they didn't give their workers notice. And so workers were awarded back wages and compensation for that. It took several years to win that case. It was not easy going up against Disney, and they delayed it as long as they could. So that was in some ways like a success in that we were able to hold Disney accountable for something. But we, at the same time, workers still lost their jobs, ESPN Zone still closed, and the harbor kept on moving along. What we also learned, which in some ways for us was an important lesson for us, which was that the Inner Harbor and development in general essentially rules Baltimore. There's this narrative that one party, the Republicans, they like trickle-down economics and giving money to their wealthy. And then there's this other narrative, the Democrats are opposed to that. Well, Democrats run these major cities, and they run them with that in mind, this framework around, we got to give subsidies and largesse to the wealthy developers to bring back our city in some way. So they practice the same trickle-down approach that nationally they critique, but locally they that's what they've practiced. So we learned that we were just stymied at every turn with the politics in our city around this. So when we even attempted to put forward a resolution in the city council to have a full accounting of the money that was spent on the Inner Harbor and the results. Like, you say this is going to do these things for working people in the city. Let's take a look at over the last several decades how that's been going before we just dump another $100 million into the Inner Harbor or another waterfront development. There's many of them at this point. And the city council,
right, exactly.
What did you say?
Fells Point and all that they're doing there, right?
East, there's Exelon, the energy company, has their own campus now, and then you've got Under Armour as well. So there's a lot of different waterfront properties at this point. But the city council refused to take up our resolution, and at another turn when we had the same debate about holding these accountable for another waterfront development, we wanted human rights standards to be put in place. And the city council leadership refused and even said to me personally, we can't get past the human rights words on this page. So just even the words human rights in a document was a non-starter. So that's the level of a lack of transparency and accountability at the city level. So that taught us a lot about our power and stake in the city and kind of where we can't approach this. This is a symptom of a much bigger problem. And to your point about the disinvestment, so as we're marching to the Inner Harbor, we're hearing from people in their community about the disinvestment. So at that time, rec centers were about to be shut. Half the rec centers were being proposed to be closed. People were worried about crime increasing. Those rec centers, many of which were closed, we were able to then fight to keep a rec center and a fire station open in West Baltimore, literally blocks away from where Freddie Gray was murdered in Sandtown, we're fighting to keep a fire station open.
Right.
That's the level of survival that we're talking about. So we were able to keep a rec center and a fire station open, but it also opened the door to this conversation you're talking about, okay, so you have the Inner Harbor and all this money going one way. What about our neighborhoods and how we invest in those neighborhoods? That's why we have been fighting for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and getting resources into that trust fund and getting that money back into the hands of communities to develop permanently affordable housing, as well as urban agricultural projects. We have a major community garden called the Hope Garden in West Baltimore, and the city refuses to recognize it. Like, they won't even, like, there's so much vacant land that we have a whole block that we've taken, and you can see from it literally looks like out of a science fiction movie or something. And the city refuses to acknowledge the sweat and toil that people that live in that neighborhood are putting into this garden. They won't let us even adopt it. So we have our own struggle there to have that being recognized. But there's this indifference that the city has towards people that don't have means. And if we had millions of dollars, they would give us plenty of an ear. But since we don't have means, they continue to ignore us because they're just looking to make money.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you brought up Hope Garden, because one of the other issues, of course, in Baltimore are food deserts. In Baltimore, and it's not just Baltimore; other urban areas, poor areas which have been divested, have food deserts. But no means, we're getting near our time, so I want to turn. The church does have means, right? So what? The Episcopal Church is getting ready to come in there. There are churches there. How can and must churches be present? What can they do and must do to be present beyond? Our church likes to pass resolutions, beyond passing resolutions, to really make a difference. What must they leave behind, Todd, when they leave Baltimore after their convention, to make a difference other than being a part of the monies that go toward the failed investment down at the Inner Harbor?
So I'm going to speak to two things. One is, I think that the Poor People's Campaign is a really important vehicle, very strategic vehicle for lifting up these issues in a big way. And what we saw with the pandemic in particular, but also way before that, we're not going to solve the problems of Baltimore by just being in Baltimore.
Right.
These issues of racism and poverty are so systemic and national that we need to be uniting across churches and other denominations and other walks of life to build a national movement. So getting hooked up with your state Poor People's Campaign is very important. I know that we've connected with Episcopal churches in Maryland as part of that effort. Very important. Well, I'll give you one example. So during the pandemic, and to this day, we have what we call projects of survival, where we are trying to meet people's immediate need and also have an organizing conversation. It's actually based on the Black Panther Party's own survival projects from back in the 60s, free breakfast program, medical clinics, and the like. And so we, United Workers, distributed food all over Baltimore and then did projects around the state as well, to meet people's immediate needs around eviction defense, around food, around PPE, cleaning supplies, and other issues. But so there's a way that the churches can connect around immediate needs, but not just do it in a charity way, but also do it in a way to build solidarity with people that are on the front lines of poverty and are directly impacted. The other thing, so one part of that navigating I want to end with is, so we're at a church in Cumberland, Maryland, which is one of the poorest towns in Maryland. And the church there wanted to get involved with the Poor People's Campaign. They ran a food pantry. So now we talk to people when they're coming in to get food about their conditions, what are they going through, what needs they might have. And then we're inviting them to a once a month Bible study that is a book we're reading called We Cry Justice, that was written by and edited by leaders in the Poor People's Campaign, including co-chair Dr. Reverend Liz Theo Harris. And the chapters are very short, but they are written by lay leaders as well as ministers, to give insight into one, the very day-to-day struggles, as well as how in the Bible the poor are lifted up and given a place of privilege in many respects in the Bible. So, so we have a study once a month where people from the pantry are invited in, other leaders in the community are invited in, and we do the study together, and that builds our understanding of the conditions that we're going up against and allows us to be more informed of how we would continue to do the organizing. So right now we're planning we're going to be doing some community canvases to again identify immediate needs to work on together collectively, not just us providing a charity model, but also for us to then be building relationships with people that are impacted to identify issues to continue to work on. So last summer when we did this, we ended up doing a lot of eviction defense because the moratorium was not being enforced in a lot of our communities. So that's where we put a lot of our time in last year.
Todd, thank you so much, first of all, for the work that you're doing in Baltimore and across the country with United Workers and the Poor People's Campaign. And what I hear, most importantly, that our church, as it makes itself known in Baltimore, needs to make itself known, and not only in Baltimore, but in other cities, in partnership with the people who are on the front lines, in solidarity with the poor and the disenfranchised in the various cities. And so I hope that that's a message that our church will hear from you. And thank you again for your time and for your work.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.